warnings to come to our presentation. An inconvenient fact check.
All right, so let's first go over what we are fact-checking. That is an inconvenient truth.
So An Inconvenient Truth was a film by Al Gore, the former Vice President of the United States, about climate change. It was originally I think it started out as a flow chart, and then there were book elements. But most of what it's known for was the talk, which was also then later recorded and turned into a documentary.
And the documentary is what we're fact-checking. The documentary, in particular, was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in, I believe, 2007 for its work in spreading the awareness of climate change.
Yeah, this documentary received at the time and continues to receive a lot of criticism from climate change deniers for potential factual inaccuracies. There's lots of like websites and essays and whatnot dedicated to debunking an inconvenient truth.
It's very debunkable. So we went through and wrote down every unique claim that we thought could probably be verified. We found 72 of them. We then checked and reviewed those claims based on a variety of sources.
Most of these claims are relevant and specific to climate change. There are a couple others just for fun. You'll see one of them at the end. In general, Gore gets most of his facts right, but a lot of like tangential or relatively unimportant things are just plain false or sometimes ambiguous. And nowhere in An Inconvenient Truth does he give pretty much any sources.
If you get one thing from this, the moral of the story is cite your sources. Please, for the love of all that is holy, cite your sources.
There's not even like a little link on the bottom or anything. He just talks, which is kind of frustrating from a fact-checking point of view and kind of like serves to undermine his credibility.
Nevertheless, we were able to verify most of the claims. We used 2005 data to check basically Gore's actual claims at the time. If they were debunked since, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt because what he had available to him suggested that a certain claim would be true.
This also means that when he says stuff like this year set records, he's talking about 2005.
So our categories are as follows. True or false are pretty self-explanatory. Something that is definitely true or definitely false. We have it sourced from 2005. Then we have over and underestimate, generally numerical claims that are true in that a certain effect will happen, but not true in how far the effect will go.
Misleading stuff is stuff where Gore said stuff weird and we're just like, which is a fair amount. Reasonable is stuff that, seriously bro, you can't expect us to fact check 30 diseases. But it seems legit based on the other contextual stuff, or where we couldn't find a specific statistic, but it was like within a small margin of error.
Then there are unverifiable claims, which, again, we just can't find things, or we think Gore had some sort of source that isn't public. So let's see how Al Gore does.
Al Gore Mythbusters.
So we lend Al some intellectual shareability here. We're going to give him the benefit of the doubt if his claim is ambiguous. We're going to assume a version of the claim that's substantiated by the data. This is because in this documentary, he's specifically appealing to a non-scientific audience. He doesn't cite his sources, and a lot of his metaphors are vague. And it's totally possible that some of his data could be from personal interactions, seeing as he's a well-known political figure. He has access to more resources than we do. So given the case that we can't verify the specific number of his claim, or we can't find a specific source to corroborate his claim, or his claim is worded confusingly, we're going to assume charitability here.
Al knows what he's talking about to the point where we're going to assume that he knows the data supports a certain interpretation of his claim, so his intention is to make that interpretation.
What we don't do is we don't look at things where he's obviously false or where there is one interpretation. We aren't labeling those as true. We aren't giving Gore any more credit than we think he deserves. We're not calling false things true. We're not calling misleading things true. But if there are two options for what we could be doing, we're going to pick the one that looks better to Gore. And as you're about to see, that doesn't make that huge of a difference.
So here's the overall evaluation of Al Gore's claims. most of them, a solid majority, are true or reasonable.
I think that's 70.8, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
And then a 29.2, not that you can read that either.
Are false or dubious in some way. That it does include unverifiable when it may not necessarily need to contain unverifiable, but the overall takeaway here is that a vast majority of Al Gore's claims in this documentary are true, and most of them pertain to the overall message of climate change being real and being something we need to take care of. If we go dig into these numbers a little bit, we get this.
We categorize reasonable under true, and then there's a solid margin of claims that are false. That's like 8% of his claims that are just outright flat false. And misleading and erring on either side make up another like 10%. This is a frankly ridiculous amount of uncertainty for a talk given by an American vice president all over the world, literally all over the world. This is a ridiculous level of inaccuracy, and yet.
At the same time, few of his claims are like directly false. A lot of them are going in the right direction.
And his overall thesis is definitely true. Climate change is happening. It is affecting people. Most of the things that he says are happening. But because he screwed up a significant amount of the stuff he says, his credibility goes down.
Al claims in the documentary that he's given the slideshow over 1,000 times, which for the record we rated reasonable. And for a slideshow that he's given so often and put so much work into, we would really think that more of this graph should be dark blue, should be true, but it's not. All right, let's move into some claims.
So as far as just outright true claims go, like Tara said, it's important to note that his overall thesis is correct, and any of the things that are false are generally just false numerical claims or confusing metaphors within the context of a broader true thesis. Most of his claims about CO2 emissions, effects of global warming, and action against climate change are true. So as such, his thesis is being truthfully conveyed.
So even if you get a worse picture in your head of Al Gore's credibility, you should not suddenly reject this entire documentary. This is the main thing about CO2 emissions here, and that forms the core of his thesis, and this graph demonstrates that it's true, as we're going to do right now.
So, to start off with, one of the claims that Al Gore made was that a 20-foot rise in sea level would flood the World Trade Center memorial site in New York City. And this sounded frankly ridiculous at the time, especially considering a 20-foot sea level rise is terrifyingly possible. But when Hurricane Sandy flooded New York by 20 feet of water, the World Trade Center memorial site did actually go underwater. So not only do we have proof that it is within the range where it would flood, it has actually flooded.
He also claims that atmospheric CO2 concentrations haven't exceeded 300 parts per million for the past 650,000 years. He does this using data from ice cores. This is true. The ice cores, in fact, go farther, and in that time still haven't exceeded 300 parts per million.
Haven't exceeded 300,000.
I think we are at 900,000 is what they can currently get. That's a picture of a person looking at some ice cores. It's really cool. They actually drill down deep into the Arctic ice and pull up great big tubes of it, and then they sample the carbon dioxide concentration in the gas bubbles trapped inside it, which is super cool.
And then he says global warming causes drought. This one's pretty intuitive. While it is true that global warming can increase precipitation, as we'll discuss later on, it's also true that that precipitation is more irregular and spaced differently across the world, and so it can cause drought in certain areas, as we've seen in California and just the broader North American West over the last 10 years.
Warmer air also sucks up more moisture from the soil, which makes it hard for it to grow, even in places where the heat would ordinarily be normal.
All right, let's move to some more true claims. He claims Antarctica's Larsen B ice shelf melted in 35 days. That is the area of the Larsen B ice shelf. It is the size of Rhode Island. And
Rhode Island worth of ice.
And did in fact, and Rhode Island worth of ice doesn't take into account thickness. That's like a gigantic ice shelf. And it did, in fact, melt in 35 days, surprising the entire scientific community.
Yeah, people thought it was going to take, what was it, 100 years to melt?
That was what
Or
he
it wasn't
said,
gonna melt for
and-
100
But
years?
also,
No,
we
it was
couldn't
true.
find any sources.
I
on
did
the-
find a source, and
Oh,
it
you did?
was correct.
Cool. So, people didn't know that people thought that it would be stable for 100 years. And then it
Yeah.
melted 35 days.
Jesus
It's
Christ.
also true that New Orleans set a heat record in 2005. I don't know if you know what happened in New Orleans in 2005, but not necessarily a coincidence.
Also that US carbon emissions per capita are the greatest compared to any continent. This is the case, although it's worded real funny, because comparing the US to continents is strange. He uses a big graphic that's interesting, to
But
put it mildly.
This was true in 2006. I believe it's actually still true. He also claims that if Greenland melted, the oceans would rise by 20 feet. This is pretty much true. Current estimates claim 23, but previous estimates pretty much bear out 20 feet. It's hard to imagine the entirety of Greenland just suddenly tumbling into the sea and melting, but if it did, that's what would happen.
And actually, there are signs that that could happen. There are ice flows currently running down the top of the Greenland ice that are carving their way down into the core of it, which means that Greenland might split and the ice might slide into the sea, which wouldn't raise the sea levels because that's just ice, but if it's split up and in the water, it's likely to melt a lot faster.
So it's also true that Greenland melting might cause ocean currents to stop. He's specifically talking about the Gulf Stream, the current that keeps Europe warm compared to its latitude. Influx of cold water into that current will disrupt it severely, and it has happened historically. There's evidence that in the past, an influx of cold water into the northern Atlantic Ocean has stopped or slowed the Gulf Stream, which is a serious threat of climate change that's not often discussed, is the fact that that single current, which is responsible for basically like England being livable, might be disrupted.
I mean, it's at about the same latitude as Quebec.
Al also claims that global CO2 fluctuations happen throughout the year because most of Earth's land is above the equator. This is true. It's because the vast majority of the land area also contains the vast majority of vegetation, which, as we know, does photosynthesis to take CO2 out of the air. And then when the northern vegetation loses its leaves in winter, we see substantially less photosynthesis and as a result more CO2. There are also 43 other true claims. We just want to make note that those are there so you don't think that these are it, but we also have finite time, so we're not going to go through all of them.
This is the vast majority of Gore's claims that are just outright true, that we checked and they are the case. But we're also going, but it would be really boring if we just recapped everything true in his presentation. So instead, let's move on to some false claims. These are the mess-ups, the statistical errors, the where the heck did you even get that particular factoid, the arbitrary tangents, and everything else outright false. And these make his credibility plummet, so we're going to look at them in specific.
All right. That's not the right button.
Here's a handful, but not all, of the false claims.
So some of his interesting claims are that 2004 was an all-time record for tornadoes in the U.S. and that Japan set a record for typhoons in 2004. Neither of these are true by any metric if you count by wind speed, by number of storms, by severity, by damage in dollars, by lives lost. By basically any metric we could think of, we couldn't prove either of these claims true.
Also, the biggest for tornadoes wasn't even close by a couple of years. The record for tornadoes has sat at 1972, since 1972. This doesn't even show a correlation with climate change.
Yeah, tornadoes don't have much to do with climate change, directly anyways.
He also claims that polar bears, as a result of melting ice in the Arctic, are drowning. This is not true. Polar bears do not simply swim out into the ocean and then just give up. They return to where they came from.
Usually where they came from still has ice.
That's me as a polar bear.
So even if the polar bear is like in a section of ice, and the edge of the ice recedes, that isn't like sinking entire islands that are nowhere close to land. Polar bears aren't drowning at sea because the edge of the ice is creeping back a few feet.
We should, however, still be worrying about polar bear habitat loss, but they're not drowning.
They're generally starving to death if they die. But yeah, he has a really sad animation of this polar bear swimming out and it can't find new ice, and so it just drowns because it's exhausted, I guess. That'd be pretty silly evolutionarily if you think if a polar bear just swam out into open water and didn't find ice and just kept going until it exhausted itself. So obviously that's not happening. We're not exactly sure why he said that.
So Al Gore's, like the key metaphor he uses is the boiling frog, which asserts that when a frog jumps into boiling water, it will jump out and be unharmed, but if it is put into water and then the water is set to boil, it will not notice the slow temperature increase until it is too late and it will die. This is also false.
Hint, it's a metaphor for climate change.
When a frog jumps into boiling water, it will often get hurt. And a frog will, in fact, recognize the temperature change and jump out of the water before it boils. We, as humans, should also recognize the temperature change. Be like a frog.
Be like a frog, not a metaphorical frog.
So now for some misleading claims. These are all of his misleading claims. One of them is that sea ice reflects over 90% of the solar radiation that hits it. This is true only in the case of ice that's covered in snow. Ice that is not covered in snow has a lower reflectivity. Still higher than ocean water, but it's not quite 90%.
He also claims in the very beginning of the movie / presentation that the atmosphere is growing thicker, not more dense, but taller. The wording here is very odd because I don't think that's what Gore actually meant.
But in the context, he was talking about how the atmosphere is a very thin shell over the Earth, like with pictures of its thinness relative to the rest of the Earth. And then goes on to talk about its thickness, but in possibly the context of density?
It's very unclear, so we read it as misleading. He also claims that CO2 emissions of China and the EU are increasing, that they are playing a bigger part in climate change relative to the rest of the globe. This has a lot of qualifiers on it. It is true if you include both China and the EU, and you include changes in the EU's carbon emission when it admits additional countries, which kind of belies the point that the EU is reducing its overall carbon emissions relative to the rest of the globe through climate change policy.
Also that Gore's mentor was the first person to launch to measure atmospheric CO2, which is a fun little thing he claimed by way of bolstering his credibility at the beginning of the slideshow. Well, I think you were the one that did the most research.
Yeah, so it turns out the first measurements were by a guy named Charles David Keeling in Mauna Loa, Hawaii, and he was going to pack up before Ravel talked to him, and he wanted to, in the context of global warming, measure atmospheric CO2, and he convinced Keeling to stay. So this claim has a grain of truth, but it's not directly true that Ravel was doing the measurements. All right, moving next to reasonable claims.
That global warming causes stronger storms. By several metrics, yes, but also how are you defining storms and how are you defining stronger? We decided that given the available array of definitions, this was probably true, that by most definitions of stronger, storms are stronger when there's more heat.
Sandeep to the front desk, please.
This is one
Sandeep.
that caused us a lot of suffering, is the 200 cities and towns in Western US set all-time records for heat in 2005. We, as high school students, just don't have access to this type of data, but considering that the Western US more broadly, and lots of states in the Western US set temperature records, it seems reasonable that a fair number of cities and towns in the Western US would set temperature records. So we mark this one as reasonable even though we don't know the exact number.
It's also hard to find studies about setting records. 2005, the internet.
There are a lot of towns in the Western US, however, so it seems plausible that 200 of them would set records.
Definitely at least 200 towns in the Western US.
There's our old pal population statistics. He refers to the area around Shanghai and the areas around Calcutta and East Bangladesh. It's also really hard to work out what he means by the area around and east. So we have a little bit of fun with
For
those.
Shanghai, including a modest amount of the suburbs gets you to 40 million, so that seems quite plausible. And East Bangladesh and Calcutta are one of the most densely populated regions in the world and have definitely a population in over 50 million people by some definition, so we rated this one reasonable as well. Go ahead.
We mentioned this earlier, that Gore has given his presentation at least 1,000 times. This was a joking aside in his PowerPoint, but we decided it was worth looking into. Apparently a couple of news outlets estimated it as 100 times a year. That's like once every 3 days that he's given this presentation. It's given a lot of times. So given how long he's been doing that for, that's definitely at least 1,000. There have also been different versions of the presentation. There's a later version that's decidedly less false.
He also claims that Alaska's tundra is only drivable by oil-carrying trucks 75 days per year. This claim gave us a lot of strife when trying to verify it. And eventually we found contemporary data that says it's only drivable at all 100 days per year, and that was as of 2006, I believe. But cars and oil-carrying trucks are two very different things.
This is a particularly interesting statistic because it's an example of how global warming is killing the oil industry. So it's putting significant handicaps. This is down from, what, 150 days a year?
It was more than that.
But yeah, they're at less than half the oil productivity for just transportation.
He also claims 30 new diseases have emerged in the last quarter century as of 2005. This is almost certainly true. There's Ebola, there's a bunch of swine flu you may have heard about. All sorts of different outbreaks have taken place, largely as a result of chain of disease vectors from climate change. So we rate that one reasonable. Moving on to overestimates.
Yeah, so some of his overestimates, if West Antarctica melted, sea levels would rise by 20 feet, although there are different definitions of West Antarctica. The best statistic we could find with the most reasonable definition in context was about 6 feet, but bear in mind there's a difference in the West Antarctic ice shelf and the region of Antarctica generally classified as Western Antarctica. Doesn't make much sense because it's on the bottom, but there's a region called West Antarctica. So, yeah, it's an overestimate, but it's in the right direction.
Also that within 15 years, which would be 2020, there will be no more glaciers in Glacier National Park. As of this year, there are probably going to be glaciers in Glacier National Park in next year. Current projections go anywhere from between there will be no glaciers in 2030 and there will be no glaciers in 2080.
He also claims in the decade, that was 2015, there will be no more snows on Kilimanjaro. There are still snow, but we don't rate it false because it has greatly decreased and is still likely to disappear in the near future.
And then he says polar water sinks at 5 billion gallons per second due to the increased density of colder water. This is specifically in reference to the Gulf Stream we were talking about earlier. This rather useless statistic is hard to source, but our rough math gives it around 2.5 billion. We don't know what source he used, but it seems in the correct direction.
All right, we're moving on to underestimates now. There are only 2 of these, I believe. Pretty simple. He claims that average annual temperatures is 58 degrees Fahrenheit. It is in fact 58.3 as of 2006. This does make a difference because that is across the entire
Lucas,
globe.
walk to the front desk, please.
Difference of
Lucas, front desk.
is actually really significant because when we're talking about warming in increments like Gore was, that's a level of precision that's entirely reasonable to expect.
He claims that the 10 hottest years on record as of 2005 were all after 1992. This is so close, but they were all after 1990. Moving to some unverifiable claims.
So he says that the European Ice Age began 10 years after the St. Lawrence Lake channeled into the ocean. We're pretty sure he's talking about Lake Agassiz, which is an ancient lake that used to cover a lot of modern-day Manitoba and northern North America in general. This was a lot of cold, icy water, and eventually it broke and flowed into the Atlantic Ocean, stopping the Gulf Stream we were talking about earlier, which caused an ice age in Europe.
Yeah, none of us were there for the last ice age.
Yeah,
and
so
there
this
was,
is the hard part, the 10 years part.
so there's no good way of telling. Whether there was 10 years or some other duration after this happened, it was certainly the cause of it, but we can't really verify this 10 years part. He further claims that the misconception about the scientific consensus was created by like a few people being paid by industries. That's at least partially true. Those people did exist. They were responsible for part of the scientific consensus, but there are other factors to blame as well. So we can't for sure say where it came from directly.
And that isn't the sort of thing you drop in a singular sentence in your presentation about the origins of climate change. Like, seriously, bro?
He also claims that there is no controversy to anyone about the current CO2 projections.
Which,
I mean, there are certainly a lot of PowerPoints debunking an inconvenient truth that would probably like a word with this particular claim. Whether or not that controversy is substantive is another matter, of course, and that's why we rate it unverifiable.
And then we have one more.
We have one more very
unverifiable
important claim.
which is that Al Gore Sr. got Breeder of the Month when Al Gore was a kid. So they lived on a farm in eastern Tennessee. Al Gore Sr. was a senator and politician as well. And Al Jr. claims that his father got an award called Breeder of the Month, I guess to lend credence to his like farmer, rural American, red-blooded American vibes.
yeah, this is part of the 10-minute tangent where he goes on and on about his family's farm, his connection to nature, and how his dad came back from the Senate sometimes to tend to the cows, which...
So, to try and verify this, I looked at every newspaper in eastern Tennessee, just the broader like Appalachian region. I called a couple newspapers. He doesn't show the title of the newspaper, he just shows the clipping. I couldn't find, on my end, any evidence that this was true.
We also
I
aren't
spent,
sure
frankly, a ridiculous amount of time on this man. Yeah, it's unverifiable.
We have no reason to believe it's false, considering it would take a lot of effort to Photoshop a newspaper clipping like
It's
that.
not that hard these days.
But
also,
when
why
in
would
2006, I bet it was.
Why would he do
All
that,
right.
though?
Yeah, exactly.
So we have a bunch of sources.
This is just a sample of the sources for the true claims we put up, the false claims we put up. This is
We
the-
have sources for every claim. If you would like our spreadsheet to see them, feel free to ask. We will
Seriously,
share it with you.
ask it. I'm proud of how I organized that thing.
You are too proud of how you organized that this week.
Look, it took effort.
But we'll take some questions if you would guys have any.
Thank you. In 5 minutes, any questions, anybody?
Any questions about even just like climate change, about any of the claims you made? Colleen?
What was the most surprising thing that you learned out of this exercise?
I'd say that Greenland melting was a real threat. Like, there's a legitimate possibility that depending on how the ice sheets crack in Greenland, we might have 20 feet of sea level rise pretty dang soon.
And shutdown of the world's ocean currents, at least some of them.
That'd freaking kill the entirety of Europe. Like,
Yeah.
you thought you had a farm in Europe? Haha, nope, you have a frost in Europe.
Although, on the converse, considering the European heat waves, they might walk back.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Could you explain the significance of the 0.3 degree increase in temperature? Like you said that was significant on a global scale, but I don't think I ever got. If you explained as to why, I never got.
Why that's significant is because of polar amplification, which isn't something we mentioned overall, but it means that changes in temperature are much higher at the poles than they are at the equator due to a variety of factors. And this means that ice will melt a lot faster, even though there's only a 0.3 degree global temperature increase. And that will result in a feedback loop because ice reflects light, as we mentioned, keeping the Earth cool. So that's why that 0.3 increase is so important.
That's also why a 2-degree average increase would be so ridiculously drastic, because that means that it's way stronger at the poles than it is at the equator. So it might only be like, around the equator, it might only be like 1 degree of warming, but at the poles that's, say, 5, and that does a ridiculous amount of damage to the water circulation of the Earth.
And Gordon actually makes that claim, and it's true, because I just have to go.
I don't think any of us actually know, I don't think any of the scientists even have an idea how bad it would be if all of the currents in the ocean just shut down completely.
But it's safe to assume that would be quite devastating.
One of the scary things about the ocean current specifically is just that we don't really know exactly what it would take for these currents to shut down, and we don't know what would happen if say the Greenland ice sheet melted and halted the Gulf Stream. We just don't really know exactly what effects that would cause. It's really hard to quantify beyond a certain point. We know that it can happen, and we know that it will be bad, but we have no idea how to quantify like the specific effects that would have, just because there's so many different factors that go into ocean currents and the broader climate in general.
Considering Greenland melting would also be responsible for 23 feet of sea level rise and a substantial portion of major cities being inundated, we should probably worry about that one too.
That's like 2/3 of the population of Florida. And that's just Florida.
Any other questions? We're almost out of time.
Cool. Thanks
Thank
for
you all.
coming.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming.
Wonderful.
What about the like, I know not a lot of people live in Greenland, but people